Tokyo, late summer, 1945. The streets feel scorched and brittle, more like cooled ash than roads, with house frames jutting up like ribs in a burned-out chest. The imperial palace sits in the distance, not triumphant, just quiet, a memory watching over the ruins. Less than 2 weeks after the emperor's surrender broadcast, the first Americans arrive in the capital, stepping down without ceremony into a city that expects the worst. For years, fear had been taught like a lesson at bedtime. Enemies were told as monsters, cruel, unforgiving. But the men who roll in are sunburned and young, sweltering in khaki, fanning themselves with helmets, pockets heavy with things that glitter like treasure. Chocolate, canned meat, chewing gum. Children notice first. Barefoot, thin, eyes too large for their faces, some in shirts cut from old futons. Mothers pull them back into alleys, afraid of what kindness might cost. Elders mutter about shame and defeat, unable to watch a beaten capital receive its conquerors. But hunger is louder than pride. The children stare at bulging packs and wonder about taste before danger. A boy asks his sister in a small voice if the strangers really eat all that. It is not a brave question. It is an honest one. For years, state messages painted Americans as beasts, with posters and broadcasts that made hatred feel like safety. Even as the war faded, the rumors kept running. They will poison wells. They will burn shrines. They will enslave families. Yet what comes through the smoke is something ordinary, and that is the shock. Tired young men, rifles slung without urgency, faces caught between curiosity and grief at what they see. Somewhere, a soldier writes a line in a little book. The city looks like the moon. The people look back without rage. Only empty eyes. Too many children, too hungry. Hunger is the axis of this first meeting. By late 1945, daily rations fall below 1,500 calories, and people stretch meals with weeds, acorns, and even sawdust. Children faint at school. Growth stalls. Black markets bloom and cracks. Mothers weep in silence. Fathers turn away from their children's smiles, ashamed that survival might arrive in a stranger's hand. But children do not negotiate ideology. They chew until gum sticks in their hair. They lick sweet from their fingers and let new truths melt faster than sugar. The soldiers laugh softly, almost shy, as if feeding is easier to bear than fighting. Not everyone yields to the moment. In the same streets, bitterness speaks. "Shameful," says an old man, watching a neighbor's boy run with a bar clutched like a prize. We bow for food now. Even he cannot ignore the light on the child's face. Hunger is a ruthless teacher. It teaches pragmatism quicker than pride. For the Americans, kindness is both instinct and policy in motion. Relief under the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers will take time to scale. Shipments of wheat and milk powder will require months to move. But soldiers carry rations. Soldiers see children. Handing out food is easier than explaining occupation. A smile is easier than a speech. It is also a way back to themselves after years of killing. This simple act will ripple outward. Scattered gifts will become official aid, school lunches, and a new daily table for a defeated nation. But in this first dusk, no one thinks in programs. People think in tastes and chances. An enemy bending low to feed a child. By nightfall, word moves across ruins. The Americans come with guns, yes, but also with food. Fear does not leave. Curiosity arrives beside it. A jeep stops by a small shrine with a roof half fallen from firebombing. a bell sounding somewhere nearby, solemn and strange. A soldier lifts down a tin of milk powder. Dozens of children gather close, eyes wide with expectation instead of terror. He smiles, awkward and human, and offers the tin. The bell keeps ringing. In that sound is surrender, hunger, and the first quiet hint that recovery might begin not with victory or vengeance, but with a spoonful of foreign food. In Osaka's narrow lanes, smoke still drifting along blackened walls, a small boy named Haruo sits on a step.
45. Japan's food intake falls below what a body needs to sustain itself, and imports remain far short of pre-war amounts. Adults faint at work. Children's bellies swell with hunger. Relief shipments begin under Allied administration, but distribution takes time. In the gap, the sight of a ration offered by hand weighs more than the can or the bar itself. In Yokohama and Nagoya, soup lines appear. Powdered milk whisked into heat. Bowls passed into chipped porcelain and shaking fingers. Some children gag at the taste. They drink anyway. Warmth is stronger than unfamiliarity. Parents keep a distance, faces stiff with unease. To accept food from the enemy is to admit dependence. One Osaka mother later remembers crying as her son drank. She wanted him to live. She felt her pride dissolve. Pride is fragile in these months. Every kindness threatens to crack it further. Starvation makes the choice. American soldiers feel the strangeness too. A man who fought on a hard Pacific island says decades later that handing a can of meat to a boy felt like giving away the world. Back home, the same meat had been a joke. In these streets, it is treasure. Humor sneaks in despite ruin. A grandmother boils the pink meat for hours, certain it is raw pork, and complains when it turns to mush. Another family tries to fry milk powder into patties and scrapes the pan clean with a sigh. These clumsy moments matter. The gifts carry culture with the calories, and misunderstanding sometimes ends in laughter that no one expected. Children remember in bright detail. A boy says the first real sugar made his tongue ache with joy. A girl holds her first candy bar without eating, afraid it will vanish, then takes a bite and says it feels like eating light. The memories do not cancel the grief. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are still open wounds. Tokyo still whispers of the March night when more than 100,000 died under fire. To take chocolate from the same hands that dropped burning canisters is almost impossible. And yet it happens. Every bite holds a paradox. Sweetness and bitterness tangled tight. By late autumn, scattered giving began. Milk becomes more than food. It becomes a sign that survival might be shared.
The ruins of Japan were more than physical. They were emotional landscapes, crumbled just as thoroughly as the brick and timber of its cities. Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Yokohama, Osaka, all bore scars that could not be swept clean in a single season. Nearly 9 million people were left without homes in the final months of 1945, living in shelters made of tin, tarps, and salvaged boards. Winter bit through walls that were not there. Children slept with empty bellies, and adults fought off the weakness that dulled both body and spirit. Into this devastation came the occupiers, their uniforms crisp, their supplies abundant. The contrast was lost on no one. General Douglas MacArthur, the figure looming over occupation policy, insisted from the very beginning that famine must be prevented. He understood what his men saw with their own eyes. Starving people could not be governed. In his dispatches, he wrote, "Give them food, and we will earn more than obedience. We will earn a chance for peace." His words filtered down into action.
American wheat arrived by the ton. Milk powder was stacked in warehouses. Plans were made for school lunch programs that could reach millions of children. Relief organizations like CARE and the Red Cross joined in, funneling calories into a country where survival had become a daily negotiation. But the grand numbers only tell part of the story. On the ground, the exchanges were deeply human, awkward, and often tinged with pride and shame. A father in Yokohama stood in the soup kitchen line where American flour had been baked into rough loaves of bread. He tore off a piece for his son. When the boy asked if he would eat too, the father just shook his head and smiled. Years later, in an oral history, that boy recalled, "I realized then my father had not eaten for days." Survival was measured not in calories alone, but in sacrifices made in silence. The humiliation of dependence weighed heavily. Men who had once marched for the empire now queued behind their children, bowls in hand. One remembered his unease. "I fought against them in the Pacific. Now
Became a kind of reconciliation, not just for the civilians, but for the occupiers themselves. A chance to reclaim the humanity that war had scoured from them. The statistics remain staggering. By 1946, over 870,000 tons of food had been imported to Japan through American aid programs. School lunches, introduced in Tokyo and later spread nationwide, were reaching millions of children by 1947. These programs provided not just calories, but stability, allowing education to resume in buildings that were little more than patched-up ruins. Children who had once fainted in class from hunger now lined up for bowls of stew and bread rolls. For them, food became inseparable from learning. Survival became entwined with the future. Yet even as these gestures soothed, they also deepened contradictions. Civilians remembered the firebombings that had killed entire neighborhoods. They remembered Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where shadows burned into stone told of lives extinguished in an instant. How could the same hands that dropped fire from the sky now serve bread and milk? The question haunted adults, less so the children, but it lingered in every bite. One survivor of the Tokyo firebombing recalled, "When my daughter ate American bread, I felt both relief and anger. They burned my home. Now they feed her. Which is their true face?" The Americans themselves often stumbled in the cultural gaps. Spam baffled households. Wheat felt alien compared to rice. And powdered milk left aftertastes children found strange. Still, hunger made even the strange welcome. And over time, adaptations occurred. Wheat turned into noodles, and bread into sandwiches, foods that would eventually become staples of a modern Japanese diet. In this way, necessity reshaped culture. Each meal was a quiet negotiation between past identity and present survival. Humor threaded itself into this transformation. In Osaka, children discovered bubble gum and promptly stuck it to their foreheads, assuming it was a decoration. In Tokyo, a grandmother mistook cocoa powder for soil fertilizer and spread it in her garden, later wondering why it smelled so sweet. These small missteps, remembered with laughter years later, softened. Man who had been a teenager in 1945 later recalled the transformation. "At first, I hated the bread. I hated that it meant we depended on them. But I also hated the hunger more. And slowly I realized I looked forward to it. That confused me. How can you hate and need the same thing?" His words capture the paradox of the moment, the conflict that defined post-war Japan. To despise reliance on the enemy, yet to recognize in their food the possibility of survival, and even hope. As the first full winter after the surrender settled over the islands, snow blanketed the ruins, and the cold sharpened hunger even further. Relief shipments increased, but so did desperation. Fires were stoked in tin shacks. Bowls passed from hand to hand. Soldiers and civilians encountered each other across a gulf of language and loss. Each encounter carried more weight than the food itself. It was a test of whether former enemies could inhabit the same fragile present. And in those ruins, a new kind of story was taking root, one where meals replaced weapons and school lunches replaced battlefields. Yet the tension remained, as if every bite carried both gratitude and grief. The Japanese people were learning to see their conquerors as something more complex than demons. And the Americans were learning that peace could not be enforced by rifles alone. But the most powerful shift was yet to come, one that would turn these scattered gestures into something permanent, transforming not only diets, but imaginations. For in the years ahead, food would become not just relief, but a foundation for trust, a bridge between conqueror and conquered that neither side had expected. By 1947, the rhythm of relief had become routine. Ships unloaded sacks of wheat and barrels of powdered milk into Japanese ports. Trucks rumbled through shattered neighborhoods, delivering goods that were once unimaginable luxuries. For children who had grown up in hunger, the sound of a ladle striking the bottom of a pot in a schoolyard was as comforting as the ringing of temple bells had once been. They lined up with dented bowls and wooden spoons, their breath clouding in the winter air, their chatter echoing against walls rebuilt from scrap. Each bowl carried more than soup. It carried the promise that tomorrow might look different from yesterday. The school lunch program cuisine had its roots in those post-war meals. Amid these routines, relationships deepened. Civilians who once avoided eye contact with American soldiers began to exchange nods, then words, then cautious laughter. Children followed jeeps, not with fear, but with anticipation, waving and shouting for candy. Letters of thanks, scrolled in shaky hiragana, were delivered to occupation headquarters. One note from a Tokyo boy read simply, "Dear soldier, thank you for bread. I will study hard so I may become strong." The soldier who received it kept it folded in his wallet for the rest of his life. This was not the story either side had expected. Americans had braced for hostility, perhaps even guerrilla resistance. Japanese civilians had braced for cruelty, perhaps even enslavement. Instead, what emerged was something far stranger: compassion shared across the rubble of war. It did not erase the trauma of firebombings or the atomic shadows on the walls, but it added a new chapter, one where the enemy was no longer only a destroyer, but also a provider. That contradiction became the seed of a fragile trust. Still, that trust was never simple. Older generations often resisted it, clinging to a grief that would not be softened by bread. Mothers sometimes muttered that food from the enemy was a bitter medicine. Fathers warned their children not to become too fond of the foreigners. But the children themselves were already changing. They laughed as they blew bubbles from chewing gum. They sang songs while clutching loaves of bread. They whispered about soldiers who smiled instead of shouted. For them, America was no longer only fire from the sky. It was also chocolate in the palm of their hands. Humor made its way into this complicated dance. Children described peanut butter as sticky candy paste, baffled by its salty sweetness. Grandmothers tried to serve bread with chopsticks. Soldiers chuckled when they saw children trade candy for marbles, inventing new economies of joy in alleyways. These tiny moments became threads in a fabric of connection, binding two peoples who had once known each other only through violence. The larger transformation was ideological. The American occupation, guided by MacArthur's staff, was not merely military. Not vanish. Another from Hiroshima described the irony. The same America that had destroyed my city gave my daughter milk. She drank it every day. She grew tall, taller than I ever thought possible. I could not forgive, but I could not deny the truth of that milk. These voices capture the paradox. Reconciliation born not of forgetting, but of the stubborn insistence of survival. The Americans, too, carried memories of this unlikely exchange. Decades later, veterans of the occupation often spoke not of combat, but of children. One recalled, "I still see their faces when we gave them soup. They bowed so politely, even though they were starving. Broke me more than battle ever did." For soldiers hardened by years of war, handing out food was a way back to their own humanity, a proof that victory did not require cruelty. The result was not instant friendship, but a gradual knitting of lives once torn apart. The act of feeding created shared spaces where language barriers faltered, but smiles prevailed. In the markets rebuilt from rubble, American flour was sold alongside Japanese vegetables. In schools, children recited lessons on democracy between bites of bread. The occupation was still an occupation, filled with power imbalances and quiet resentments. But beneath it pulsed the rhythm of meals that could not be ignored. And in this rhythm lay the seeds of something greater. By the early 1950s, as Japan began its climb toward economic revival, memories of hunger receded but never disappeared. Adults who had once been children under occupation carried with them the strange, unshakable image of American soldiers handing out food in ruined streets. They remembered chocolate melting in their mouth, gum sticking to their fingers, bowls of milk steaming in the cold air. For many, these memories coexisted uneasily with memories of bombings, a contradiction they would wrestle with for the rest of their lives. But contradictions can become bridges. The story of Japan and America after the war is not simple triumph or simple defeat. It is a story of paradox, where kindness sprouted from violence, and survival was offered by those who had once delivered destruction. It is a story of how children, unburdened by the full weight of
enemy, gave food to their children.
It is remembered not as humiliation, but as the strange, tender beginning of something no one had dared to expect. And if the world has learned anything from that chapter, it is this, that sometimes the most lasting victories are not won with fire or steel, but with kindness measured in spoonfuls.